The sun had barely kissed the horizon when the faint sound of hooves reached Maddox's ears. He'd been expecting the usual quiet of the evening, the kind that came with the long shadows stretching across the barren landscape. But the sound grew louder, closer, and that only meant one thing. Trouble was coming. A lone rider. As the rider came into view, Maddox squinted against the setting sun, trying to make out the figure. It wasn't one of his ranch hands. The silhouette was too slender, the horse too well kept for anyone who worked the land, and when the rider came closer, Maddox's gut tightened. It was a woman. She was tall, with dark hair streaming behind her in the wind, her face half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. But it was her eyes that held his attention, piercing and full of purpose. She didn't look like someone who belonged in these parts, with her fine clothes and boots that didn't match the weathered earth she was riding through. She pulled up in front of him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maddox sized her up, wondering what the hell she wanted. Most folks who came out this way were either looking for work or a place to lay low, but this woman, with the way she sat straight in the saddle and held his gaze, told him she wasn't either. "You the owner of this place?" Her voice was soft, but carried a confidence that made the ground beneath him feel even more solid. Maddox nodded, eyes narrowing as he studied her. "What brings you out here?" "It's a long ride for anyone who's not looking for a fight." She gave a short laugh, a sound that didn't quite match the sternness in her eyes. "I'm not looking for a fight, Mr. Maddox," he replied, his voice gruff. "And I'm guessing you're not out here just for the view." The woman tilted her head, appraising him with an air of calculation. Then, without further ado, she slid off her horse and stepped toward him, her boots clicking sharply against the dusty earth. She didn't offer a handshake, nor did she wait for an invitation. "I'm Evelyn Hart," she said, as though that name would mean something to him. "I need your help, Mr. Maddox." "I don't usually offer help to strangers." His tone was colder than the breeze that had picked up. "I'm not asking for charity," she replied smoothly, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "I'm asking for a business arrangement." Maddox folded his arms across his chest. His curiosity piqued, but not enough to let his guard down. "Go on." Evelyn reached into the folds of her coat and pulled out a leather pouch, tossing it lightly onto the table beside him. It landed with a soft thud, and when Maddox opened it, he found $10,000 inside crisp bills, each one more than enough to buy half a town. Maddox raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking from the money to Evelyn. "What's this?" "That's my offer," she said, not even blinking as she continued. "I'll pay you $10,000 to marry me." Maddox's first instinct was to laugh, but something about the way she looked at him, calm and steady, stopped him. This wasn't a joke. He met her gaze, trying to see through the calm demeanor. "Marry you?" he repeated, voice skeptical. "Why the hell would you want to marry me?" Evelyn's lips tightened for a moment, and then she spoke, her words careful, weighed with experience. "Because I need a husband, Mr. Maddox, and I need one fast." The words hung in the air between them, the wind picking up and swirling dust around their feet. Maddox took a long moment, still unsure if he was being played for a fool. A marriage wasn't something you entered into lightly, especially out here. The law didn't reach far in these parts, and there wasn't much left to hold on to but pride and hard-earned land. "And why me?" Maddox asked, finally shaking his head. "There's plenty of men in these parts. You can find yourself a husband who'd be a damn sight more eager than me." "I'm not looking for eagerness, Mr. Maddox," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence. "I'm looking for someone who can keep a secret, someone who isn't going to ask questions or make things difficult, and that someone is you." He stared at her for a long time, the weight of her words sinking in. Secrets. That didn't sit right with him. There was always trouble when secrets were involved, especially with people who looked as if they had something to hide. "You think I'm just gonna marry you, no questions asked?" he said, trying to gauge if she was serious. She didn't flinch. You'll take the money, Maddox. You'll marry me, and you'll keep your mouth shut. In return, you get $10,000 in your pocket. And if you decide to help me out in other ways, the rewards will be far greater. The air seemed to grow still as the silence stretched on. Maddox glanced down at the money again. $10,000. It was enough to buy a small piece of land, enough to pay off debts, and enough to start fresh. It was a tempting offer, too tempting, but then his instincts kicked in, and they were louder than any temptation. This wasn't just about money. There was something else here, something hidden behind her words, behind her calm and collected exterior. Evelyn was no ordinary woman. She was dangerous, that much was clear, and he couldn't quite figure out what her game was yet, but he sure as hell wasn't about to walk into it blind. I'm not gonna marry anyone for money, Maddox said, shaking his head slowly, especially not someone who thinks she can walk in here and make demands. But Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. She took a step closer, her voice softer but still holding that edge. You'll want to reconsider, Maddox. I'm not giving you a choice. And just like that, the conversation shifted. It wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't about marriage. It was about power, control, and Maddox's decision to either stand firm or be dragged into something bigger than he ever expected. You don't know who you're dealing with, he said, his voice dropping low. I think I do, Evelyn replied, a cold smile crossing her lips. You'll see soon enough. And as she turned to walk back to her horse, Maddox couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Maddox stood there for a long moment, his eyes following Evelyn as she walked back to her horse. The wind was picking up, swirling dust across the ground, but in that instant, everything felt still. The offer was too tempting to ignore, but there was something about Evelyn's heart that gnawed at him. He couldn't figure her out. She wasn't just another woman from the East, looking to escape to the rugged wilderness. She wasn't even a typical city dweller searching for adventure. No, she was something else entirely. Her posture, the way she moved, the words she chose, everything about her said she was used to getting her way. Maddox had known enough women like that to understand the kind of trouble they could bring. He had no desire to be pulled into the kind of mess that could turn a man's life upside down. Still, the money she'd offered sat heavy in his pocket, a reminder that there was no other way to ignore it. $10,000. He could feel the weight of it pressing against him. But the question lingered. Why me? What was she really after? And then it hit him. This wasn't just a transaction. She wasn't asking him to be a husband. She was asking him to be a cover. But for what? Turning, Maddox went back inside his ranch house. Shutting the door firmly behind him, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid sliding smoothly into the glass. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. Every inch of him told him to refuse. But another part of him, the part that had seen too many men fall into the trap of gambling, drinking, or fighting their lives away, wondered if there was more to this than just a simple offer. He thought back to her last words, the ones that had stuck with him the most. You'll want to reconsider, Maddox. I'm not giving you a choice. The sound of hooves outside the door drew his attention back to the present. He knew it was her. He'd expected this, and yet his heart raced as if he had no idea what she was about to say. He stepped to the door, and before he could open it, it creaked and swung wide. There she was, standing at the threshold. Evelyn Hart. She didn't wait for an invitation. She entered with the same quiet authority she had shown from the moment she first arrived. You're thinking about it, she said simply, her voice low and steady. Maddox didn't respond immediately, unsure of how to play this. You didn't give me much to think about. But yeah, I'm considering it. Her lips quirked into a brief smile. I don't think it's about whether or not you'll do it. It's about how much you're willing to lose if you don't. She glanced around the room, taking in the sparse furniture and the rugged life that surrounded him. The ranch wasn't much. A few acres of land, a small house, and some cattle. But to Maddox, it was everything. It was all he had left. "I didn't think you'd come back this soon," he muttered, stepping aside to let her in. Evelyn walked over to the table and sat down without waiting for him to offer her a seat. There was a confidence in the way she moved. Everything she did was calculated, every gesture precise. She was used to commanding attention, and she didn't apologize for it. "You think you have a choice, don't you?" she asked, watching him carefully. Maddox was quiet for a moment. He poured another drink for himself, then another for her. When he handed her the glass, she took it without a word, her fingers brushing his. It wasn't much of a gesture, but there was something about it that felt like a promise. "I've lived a long time without anyone telling me what to do," Maddox said, his voice calm. "You think I'm just going to roll over for you?" Evelyn took a sip from her glass, her eyes never leaving his. "It's not about rolling over. It's about survival. You might not have noticed, but there's a lot more at stake than just your pride." Maddox set his glass down with a quiet thud. "And what exactly is at stake here? You want a husband for a day, a week, a year?" Evelyn leaned back in her chair, considering the question. Her gaze softened for just a second before she spoke, her tone quieter, more introspective. "It's not about the time, Maddox. It's about the reason why I'm here. You might not see it now, but things are shifting in this country. Big things. And you, whether you like it or not, are caught right in the middle of it." He raised an eyebrow, unsure what she was implying. "What does that mean?" "Let's just say," she continued, "there are people who don't take kindly to folks like you and me sticking our noses where they don't belong. And if you don't want to end up in a situation where you have no options, you might want to think about this deal a little harder." Maddox stared at her, searching her face for any sign that she was bluffing, but Evelyn didn't flinch. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no fear. "You don't think I can handle myself?" Maddox said, his voice laced with a hint of challenge. "No," Evelyn replied evenly. "I think you can handle yourself, but I don't think you want to." For the first time since she'd arrived, Maddox's stomach twisted with uncertainty. Her words hung in the air, slicing through the tension that had settled between them. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't even about money, really. This was about something bigger. The stakes were rising, and he was beginning to realize that he didn't have the full picture. Evelyn stood then, and as she did, Maddox rose to his feet as well. She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. "Think about it, Maddox. You've got a good life here, sure, but in a week, a month, it could all be gone. Your ranch, your cattle, your freedom." She didn't wait for a response, slipping out the door and disappearing into the darkening night. Maddox stood there, his eyes locked on the door she'd just closed behind her. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the cryptic words she'd left him with. What was she really offering? And what was she trying to protect him from? The wind howled through the cracks in the walls of the house, but the chill that had settled in his chest was colder than any breeze. Evelyn Hart wasn't just another desperate woman looking for a husband. She was someone running from something, and now Maddox had been pulled into it. Whether he liked it or not, a decision had to be made, and soon. The choices were narrowing, and he knew that the next step might be one he couldn't take back. The morning light streamed into Maddox's cabin like a sharp blade, cutting through the dim shadows of the night. It was the kind of morning where the world outside felt both unbearably heavy and eerily quiet. His eyes opened, but they didn't register the early hour. They just stared at the ceiling for what felt like forever, his mind replaying the words Evelyn Hart had left him with the night before. Her promises, her threats, all tangled together in a haze of uncertainty. $10,000. For the kind of life he led, a rancher on the outskirts of nowhere, that was a sum worth more than a few years of sweat and hard work. But money wasn't the issue anymore. It never had been. He had lived without it, scraping by on the bare essentials. The real question was, What kind of man did he want to be? Did he want to become a pawn in some shadow game, a man with a price tag dangling over his head? Or would he stand firm and let this woman, this stranger, find someone else to manipulate? His heart pounded against his chest as he got up from the bed, pushing aside the sheets. He needed coffee. His hands shook as he prepared the coffee pot. The silence of the morning, paired with the weight of his thoughts, hung in the air like thick smoke. But no matter how many cups of coffee he drank, it wouldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just about money. Evelyn Hart, or whatever her name really was offering more than a simple business proposition. She was asking him to step into a world he had no business being a part of. And yet, here he was, wrestling with a decision that could change everything. A loud knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts, jolting him to his feet. The sound came again, sharper, more urgent. Without thinking, he crossed the room and opened the door, half expecting to find Evelyn standing there, as if she knew he wouldn't be able to resist the pull of her proposition. And there she was, her silhouette framed by the light of the early morning sun. But it wasn't the same Evelyn from the night before. Today, there was something colder in her eyes, something harder in her step. "Do we have a deal?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. Maddox didn't immediately respond. He just stood there, staring at her, trying to read the woman who had turned his life upside down in a matter of hours. His mind was clouded, but one thing was clear. He couldn't just walk away. Not after everything she'd said. Her gaze was fixed on him, unwavering. Her lips were set in a thin line, almost challenging him to turn her down. He'd heard that look in her voice last night, the kind of voice that didn't ask for a yes. It demanded it. "Not yet," Maddox finally said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. He opened the door wider to let her inside, stepping back as she entered. She wasted no time, walking past him, and straight to the table. She didn't even wait for him to offer her a seat. She simply slid into the chair, eyes locked onto his, as if she were the one in control of this moment, as if she were the one who was about to make him an offer he couldn't refuse. "Sit," she said quietly, and for a brief second, Maddox was taken aback. It wasn't the command itself that surprised him. He'd grown used to strong-willed people. It was the calm authority in her voice. It was as if she already knew the decision he would make. Against his better judgment, he sat down opposite her, his eyes still fixed on her face. Her posture was poised, controlled, but there was a weariness beneath it all. This wasn't just some woman looking for a husband. This was someone who had been through things Maddox couldn't even begin to imagine. "What do you want from me, Evelyn?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though his stomach was in knots. "You want a name on a piece of paper, that's clear. But there's more to this. I can see it in your eyes." Evelyn's lips twitched just slightly, as if she were trying to hold back a smile that didn't belong on her face. "I didn't think you'd be so quick to call me out," she said, her tone still cool. "But you're right. It's not just about the marriage. It's about what comes after." She leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the table in front of her. "You're asking the right question. The real question. Why you? And why now?" Maddox nodded, his arms crossed as he listened, his suspicion growing with every word she spoke. "I've been running from something, Maddox," Evelyn said, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "Something bigger than both of us." Maddox leaned forward, his curiosity piqued despite himself. He had known there was more to the story, but hearing it from her now made it feel all too real. He wasn't just dealing with a woman looking for a fresh start. He was dealing with someone running from a past that could ruin both of their lives. She let out a long breath before continuing, as if the words were painful to say. "My real name is Margaret Sinclair. I used to work for the government, not in any official capacity, but in a way that kept me close to the action. I was a courier. I carried information for people who didn't want it getting out. people who had enough power to ruin lives without a second thought. Maddox said nothing for a moment. He simply stared at her, his mind racing to make sense of what she had just revealed. She wasn't just running from a bad marriage or a failed relationship. She was running from a life that had involved secrets, danger, and people who would stop at nothing to protect their own interests. "What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Evelyn's face grew harder, her eyes narrowing as she seemed to withdraw into herself. "Something went wrong. I don't know what. But I ended up with information that some very dangerous people would do anything to get back. They don't care who I am, Maddox. They just care about what I know." Maddox's mind raced. This was no ordinary story, no ordinary woman. This was the kind of situation that could drag him into something far bigger than he could handle. He didn't know if he was even prepared for what she was asking of him. "But you came here," he said slowly, "to get away from them." Evelyn nodded, her eyes dark with something he couldn't quite read. "I thought I could disappear. I thought the quiet life would be enough, but they found me, and now they're coming for me. And I don't know how much longer I can stay one step ahead." Maddox didn't know what to say. The world outside had always felt like a distant place to him, full of danger and noise. But now, the chaos she was speaking of was closing in on him, and he had no choice but to face it head-on. "You think marrying me will keep you safe?" Maddox asked quietly, as if testing the words to see if they fit. Evelyn gave him a hard, almost bitter smile. "It's not about safety. It's about keeping my enemies from finding me. They won't come looking for a rancher. They won't come looking for someone who doesn't have anything to offer. But they'll come for me. They'll come for the information I have. And when they do, you'll be in this with me." Her words settled into the room like heavy stones. Maddox didn't know what to think, didn't know what to feel. He was tangled up in something far bigger than he could have imagined, and there was no going back. "I'm not just a part of this, am I?" he said, looking at her with something like resignation. "Once I'm involved, there's no way out." "No," Evelyn replied softly. "There's no going back." Maddox sat in silence, his fingers tapping against the table as he thought about the life he had built here. The quiet nights, the long days spent tending to his cattle, all of it could be ripped away in an instant if he said yes. But what would happen if he didn't? If he walked away, would it mean losing more than just his land? "Then I guess we have a deal," he said, his voice heavy. Evelyn's gaze softened just slightly, but there was no warmth in it, no joy, only the same grim determination that had brought her here in the first place. "You're not making a mistake, Maddox," she said, "but there will be consequences, for both of us." And, as she turned to leave, Maddox knew that the decision he had just made would haunt him for the rest of his life. The days following Maddox's reluctant agreement to marry Evelyn felt like days lost in a fog. His life, so meticulously simple before, was now tangled in a web of questions he couldn't untangle. Evelyn's presence in the house was almost too much to bear, yet he couldn't seem to push her out. She was everywhere, a silent shadow in his cabin, always in the background, always watching, always calculating. Her calm demeanor hid a storm underneath, one that Maddox couldn't help but feel on the edge of his skin. The marriage itself had been a formality, a simple contract, but Maddox had realized by then that he was in far too deep to just play the role of the unwilling husband. He wasn't just protecting her from an unknown threat. He was starting to see that he was being dragged into the same darkness she was fleeing. There was no turning back. Not now. It had been 3 days since they made their agreement. The morning after the ceremony, as they called it, a quiet affair with no witnesses, no fanfare. Just a simple exchange of vows spoken in the stillness of Maddox's cabin. Evelyn had begun to prepare. Her sharp eyes never missed a thing, and her every move seemed deliberate, as if she was calculating the next step in the elaborate chess game they were both now a part of. Maddox spent his days the same way he always did, tending to the ranch, checking the cattle, mending fences. But everything had changed. The quiet of the land felt more oppressive, the silence louder than it had ever been. The longer he went without hearing from Evelyn, the more anxious he became. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. It wasn't until the 5th day after their wedding that things began to take shape. Evelyn had been in town, just a few miles down the road, meeting with people Maddox had never seen before. She came back late in the evening, her face more drawn than usual, her eyes weary but sharp, like a predator who had just smelled danger on the wind. "I need to talk to you," she said. Her voice strained as she entered the cabin without knocking. Maddox glanced up from his desk, where he'd been scribbling down notes about the ranch. The flickering lamplight cast shadows across the room, and for the briefest moment, Evelyn looked like a ghost, her presence almost too cold for the warm glow of the fire. "What happened?" he asked, standing from his chair and moving toward her. He didn't have to ask. He could see it in her posture, the tightness in her shoulders. Something had shifted. The calm facade she usually carried was starting to crack. "They're getting closer," she said softly, the words like a slap. "Who?" Maddox asked, but he already knew the answer. He was just asking for clarification, as if he needed to hear it out loud to make it real. "The people I've been running from," Evelyn continued, her voice shaking slightly now. "They've got eyes on me. They're closer than I thought. They know I'm hiding out here." Maddox felt a chill run down his spine. The ranch, his home, had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. He'd spent years building this life, protecting it from the outside world. But now the outside world was crashing in on him. "What do they want?" Maddox asked, though the question felt futile. He knew what they wanted: information. And Evelyn was the one who held the key to it all. "They want what I know. They want the names of everyone I've worked with. And they want the files I've kept hidden." Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Maddox saw the weight of what she was carrying. "If they get their hands on those files, it won't just be me they come for. They'll come for you, too." Maddox felt the blood drain from his face. His mouth went dry. "You didn't tell them about me, did you?" "No." She shook her head quickly, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she wasn't as sure of that as she wanted to be. "But it won't matter soon. They're going to find out who I'm married to. They'll start making connections, and they won't stop until they've torn everything apart." Maddox stared at her for a moment, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. He had never asked for this. He had never wanted to be pulled into a world of secrets and danger. He had always preferred the simplicity of his life, the quiet hum of the ranch, the solitude he had found out here. But now, that life was slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. "So what do we do now?" he asked, his voice low, almost defeated. He had already known the answer, but he needed to hear it from her. "We don't have much time," Evelyn said, her gaze sharp again. "I've arranged for us to leave in the morning. We're going to head south, to a place where I can lay low for a while. But we can't stay there long. We need to keep moving." Maddox nodded, though the thought of leaving the ranch behind felt like an impossible decision. Everything he had built, his life, his land, his future, was here. He couldn't just walk away. "I can't leave," he said quietly, his voice filled with more emotion than he meant to show. Evelyn stepped toward him, her hand resting on his arm. Her touch was gentle, but her grip was firm, as if she knew he needed the reassurance. "You have to, Maddox. We both have to. It's the only way." He wanted to argue, to fight against the pull she was placing on him. But deep down, he knew she was right. He wasn't just involved anymore. He was entangled in something much larger than himself. If he stayed here, if he resisted, it would only put both of them in more danger. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice a whisper of defeat. Evelyn smiled slightly, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a smile that told him she had more secrets than he could possibly understand. A smile that spoke of things far darker than the ranch, than the life he had built. We go to a place called Marlow. It's a small town, tucked away in the hills. No one will be looking for us there. Maddox wasn't sure if he believed her, but at this point, he didn't have a choice. They had already crossed that threshold, and there was no going back. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Evelyn gathered her things, packing in haste, preparing for the journey ahead. Maddox, however, was slower. He stood by the window, watching the last remnants of daylight disappear behind the hills, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching the end of everything he had ever known. As night settled over the ranch, a deep unease crept into his bones. He was leaving behind everything. But what if this was the only way to survive? The next morning, they set out in silence. Maddox kept his focus on the road ahead, avoiding looking back at the ranch. It felt like the end of a chapter, the kind of end that wasn't just about a place but about an entire life. He had always been a man of the land, and now, the land was slipping away. For the first time since he'd made his decision, Maddox felt a deep sense of finality. There would be no going back to the quiet life he had once known. The world was bigger than he had realized, and its dangers were closing in faster than he could outrun them. And somewhere, in the deep recesses of his mind, he knew that this was just the beginning. The journey south felt like a slow, inexorable pull into the unknown. With every mile they crossed, Maddox felt as though he was being drawn deeper into a world that no longer made sense. His hands, calloused and worn from years of hard labor on the ranch, gripped the reins with a tightness that betrayed his unease. The road beneath the wheels seemed endless, a ribbon of dirt stretching across the barren landscape. The world around him, once familiar, once so grounded, now felt foreign and threatening. Evelyn sat beside him, her posture as rigid as ever, her eyes always scanning the horizon, always alert. She didn't speak much anymore, her words measured and few, as if she were carefully choosing every sentence she spoke. It wasn't the silence that unnerved Maddox. It was the unspoken weight that hung between them, a tension that had slowly built over days of travel. It was as though Evelyn had been carrying a burden far heavier than Maddox could imagine, and he was just beginning to feel the strain of it. For a long time, Maddox had believed he could keep his distance from whatever darkness Evelyn had brought with her. But now, every mile they traveled brought them closer to a fate he couldn't escape, a fate that seemed inevitable. He had always trusted his instincts, had always prided himself on his ability to read people and situations, but with Evelyn, everything was clouded. She was a puzzle, a mystery he couldn't solve. And the more he tried to untangle it, the more he found himself entangled in the same web. He had known she was hiding something from the start, but as the days passed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in ways he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about running from some nameless threat. It was about power, about the kind of power that could destroy lives without a second thought. And Evelyn knew. Margaret was right in the middle of it. The town of Marlow wasn't much to look at. It was smaller than Maddox had imagined, a collection of dilapidated buildings and empty streets. The air here felt heavy, as though the weight of the past had pressed down on this place, leaving it stuck in time. The town was isolated, far from the reach of the authorities, tucked away between hills that seemed to shelter it from the world. But Maddox could feel something else in the air, something darker. Evelyn led the way through the town, her steps confident, purposeful. She didn't hesitate as she passed the storefronts with peeling paint, or the broken windows that seemed to stare back at them. She was in her element here, and Maddox couldn't help but wonder just how many times she had walked this very path. How many times had she been here, under different circumstances, with a different purpose? The closer they got to the center of town, the more Maddox's unease grew. The silence was deafening. No one seemed to be on the streets, and there was an eerie stillness to the place. The kind of stillness that made every creak, every distant sound, seem amplified. The whole town felt like a trap, a place where no one left unscathed, and Maddox realized, with a sinking feeling, that they were walking into that trap. They stopped at a small, weather-beaten house at the edge of town. The house was modest, its paint chipped and faded, its windows dark and uninviting. It looked abandoned, but Maddox knew better. He had seen enough of Evelyn's world to know that appearances could be deceiving. Evelyn knocked twice on the door, her gaze scanning the area before turning back to Maddox. "Stay close," she said, her voice low but firm. Maddox didn't argue. He had learned not to question her in moments like these. Whatever was about to happen, he had to trust her, or at least, trust that she had a plan. She always did. Even when it seemed like she was flying blind, she knew exactly what she was doing. Or at least, he had thought so. The door creaked open, and a man appeared in the doorway. He was tall, with a rough face, a few days' worth of stubble, and eyes that seemed to see right through you. His expression didn't change when he saw Evelyn, but there was something in the way he looked at Maddox, a mixture of suspicion and something else, something darker. "You're late," the man said, his voice flat and without emotion. Evelyn didn't flinch. "We're here now," she replied, her voice sharp and unwavering. The man stepped aside to let them in. "I didn't think you'd bring him," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to Maddox. "But I suppose it's too late to change things now." Maddox exchanged a look with Evelyn, but she didn't seem surprised by the man's comment. She simply moved forward, her movements purposeful. He followed her into the small house, his senses on high alert. The interior was dimly lit by a few flickering lanterns. The air smelled musty, like old books and dust, and the silence in the room was suffocating. At the far end of the room, a man sat behind a desk, his back to them. He didn't acknowledge their presence at first, instead continuing to scribble something on a piece of paper. Evelyn didn't waste any time. She walked straight up to the desk, her heels clicking against the wooden floor, and placed her hand firmly on the table. "We need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The man finally looked up. His face was cold, his eyes calculating, and Maddox could feel the weight of his gaze. He studied them both for a long moment before speaking. "You brought him," the man said, his voice low and measured. "I don't know why, but it's too late now. You've made your choice." Evelyn didn't flinch. "He's with me," she said simply. "He's part of this." The man's gaze shifted from Evelyn to Maddox, and then back to Evelyn. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, disbelief, maybe, or a hint of something else. But it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "You should know," the man continued, "that once you're involved with this, there's no turning back. The files you have, they're already out there. There's nowhere to hide." Maddox's heart skipped a beat. The files. The ones that Evelyn had been hiding from everyone, including him. He had known they were important, but he hadn't fully understood the extent of their significance until now. They weren't just important, they were dangerous. And now, they were out in the open. Evelyn took a deep breath, her expression unchanging. "We'll be fine," she said, her voice calm, though Maddox could sense the strain beneath the surface. "We just need to move forward." The man didn't reply right away. He just stood there, staring at them both, as if weighing something in his mind. Then, finally, he spoke again. "You're not ready for this," he said, his voice flat. "You're not ready for what's coming. But I suppose it doesn't matter now." Evelyn's face hardened, and Maddox saw something flicker in her eyes, a mixture of fear and determination. "We don't have a choice," she said quietly. The man handed her a small, leather-bound notebook. His hands trembled ever so slightly as he passed it to her. Evelyn took it, but Maddox could see the tension in her grip. Whatever was inside that notebook was far more important than either of them could have anticipated. "This is it," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Keep it safe. Don't let anyone else get their hands on it. Evelyn nodded, slipping the notebook into her coat pocket. We won't let anyone touch it, she said, her voice unwavering. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at them both for a long time. You don't get it, he said finally. You think you can outrun this. But you can't. The clock is ticking, and they're already on their way. Evelyn stepped toward the door without another word, and Maddox followed. As they stepped out into the fading light, Maddox couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line they couldn't come back from. They weren't running anymore. They weren't trying to escape. They were walking into something much darker, a fight they couldn't win. That night, the weight of what had happened seemed to hang over them, heavier than it had before. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. There was no more running. Evelyn had always said they couldn't keep running forever. But now, for the first time, Maddox truly understood what she meant. They were standing at the edge of a precipice, and no matter which direction they chose, they would fall. As the wagon rumbled through the night, Maddox couldn't help but feel the enormity of the decision they had made. There was no escaping this world Evelyn had dragged him into. No matter how far they traveled, no matter how many miles they covered, the past would always be there, chasing them. And as the sun began to rise, Maddox realized that survival came at a price, and that price wasn't just measured in the number of lives lost. It was measured in the pieces of yourself you sacrificed along the way. Evelyn had made her choice, and now Maddox would have to make his. But in the end, they were both trapped in the same game, and there was no way out.